Okay, so hello everyone. Huge thank you to GRIMMCon for having me. Happy to be here. The speakers are amazing, so I'm just happy to be here. So I think my topic might be a little bit different today from some of the technical type stuff. I'm going to be talking about integrating behavioral analysis techniques into cybersecurity programs and sort of talking about implications of behavior and what it means to different teams. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so by day, I'm a security architect at IBM. I work in the CISO's office for the Security Innovation and Remediation Team, or SEER, as we call ourselves. By night, I'm an adjunct professor. I'm also a doctoral chair, so chairing doctoral students. I do have, as mentioned, 2 doctorates, DSc in cybersecurity, where I focused on studying vulnerability scoring and vulnerability chaining. And so for another day, if you'd love for me to just like talk for hours about vulnerability scoring and vulnerability chaining, I'd be happy to do that too. And then the PhD in human factors, I was studying still vulnerability chaining, but from a terminology aspect. So understanding how vulnerability chaining, the phenomenon of sort of how we remediate vulnerabilities, how we view vulnerabilities in combination, whether or not we do that, if that's a phenomenon. My dissertation was just published in ProQuest. So again, if you have just several hours to waste reading a really long document, it's on ProQuest if you're interested. I do come from a background in IT operations. I was in IT ops for about 12 years, 11, 12 years before I moved into security about 3 years ago. And part of what we're going to be talking about today is why I made the shift into cybersecurity from IT. I have a real soft spot in my heart for vulnerability management from the IT side, from the cyber side. I know how challenging it can be. So I really like to study that and sort of figure out how to solve some of those challenges. Love risk management, and then DFIR is just a total passion thing for me. All right, so quick disclaimer. All thoughts, feelings, views in this presentation are my own. They do not reflect any of my employers. Have to say that. And also, since we're talking about behavioral analysis, I am not a trained psychologist. I'm not a trained therapist. I do not have a degree in that. But I do love to research, and I love to see how a lot of the research concepts, phenomenon that we see in psychology can sort of help us improve what we're doing in cybersecurity as practitioners. Okay, so to break it down, we're going to start with some of the current challenges in cybersecurity. It's going to lay the groundwork for what is behavioral analysis anyway? What are you talking about? Why are we talking about this? Sort of what techniques are available, and then how is that going to tie us into cybersecurity and some of the teams, different types of teams within cybersecurity, how we can sort of apply those techniques in a practical way, because I think that's the best thing about getting an opportunity to speak about topics like this, is to give anybody in the audience some actionable takeaways, something you can actually tangibly do. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, SolarWinds. Log4j. I realize I typed cough there, but I just wanted to cough as well. We are constantly dealing with an onslaught of new types of vulnerabilities, new types of exploits, new and fun ways for the hackers, malicious actors to infiltrate our networks and ultimately, compromise our systems, whether it's with ransomware, malware, whatever it might be. DDoS, gosh, that takes down stuff all the time. So there's really this need for us to look at these challenges, look at these problems in a different way. Like ultimately, that's why I think talking about behavioral analysis, talking about perception, cognition, different psychological sort of concepts is a different way for us to look at some of these problems. I don't think I'm saying anything too crazy here when I say that annual cybersecurity training is, the way that I've seen it, it's not that effective. If we train people once a year, it's really hard to say, what are they doing on a daily basis? And do they remember the training? If they took it 6 months ago, do they remember what the training said? I know I don't. But I do cybersecurity every day, so I get to sort of see what's going on a day-to-day basis. Whereas, a lot of general users don't. It's not a part of necessarily a part of their job or something they think about all the time. They've got lots of other things going on. And this is where I wanted to bring in the idea of cognitive limitations too. We've got phishing tests, we've got annual cyber training, we've got communication for security assessments and audits, we've got new frameworks, all this complexity added into all of our cybersecurity programs. And that's just what we're doing in cyber. That's not to mention how our users are sort of trying to digest all of this information that, they might not be technical, that just might not be part of, what they do or what they were trained in. And so how can we sort of twofold, how can we help our users, not punish them or make them feel bad about it, but how can we help them? How can we make security easier for them? And then how can we as security practitioners do a better job of detection, proactive security, all of that good stuff? And not just that from a technical sense, how can we work better as teams? How can we improve our own skill sets and do what we do best even better? Because types of attacks and the amount of information that's coming at us all the time, there's only so much that we can ingest, which is cognitive limitations. There's only so much information that we can take in and really put back into the work that we use. If I read about 12 to 15 different types of vulnerabilities a day, how much of that information can I integrate, into my daily job? Since I'm in cybersecurity, probably a lot. But how much would an average user be able to digest that information along with all the other things that they need to know for their own jobs? It gets sort of difficult. So with that, what is behavioral analysis? What are we talking about? So in a nutshell, how do people behave? The field of behavioral analysis and people that work in this field, they want to understand how people work together. How do they, so for an athlete, for example, especially high-level athletes, when a second or a millisecond can make the difference between winning or losing, how can you change someone's behavior to help them improve their ability? How can you change someone's sort of patterns, the way they do things, sort of the things that they do on a daily basis? How can you change that to help them improve what they're already doing? Think about having like a bad habit, like biting your nails or something like that. Like, how do we change that behavior so that you're not always biting your nails? That's like a really nice, easy example of behavioral analysis. And people who do this as a profession and as their daily job, they have to really be able to look at physical, emotional, these sort of really biological things that a human is doing. And I think one of the reasons why I think this is such an important topic for cybersecurity specifically is that sometimes we lose the human in what we're doing. That people process technology concept that we're always talking about. We don't always talk about people as human beings. We say users or administrators or analysts or malicious actors. We don't think about the real human that's behind there. And I'll get into this in a little bit. Red teams, it's a little bit different because when you're doing social engineering, you really have to understand how people operate in a technical space. This is more about environmental factors as far as behavioral analysis goes. So you can sort of understand how someone is working in their physical environment and how that may change the way that they behave, the way that they act, and the way that they ultimately would do or do not do things that are beneficial to them. So health, fitness, all of that good stuff. Quickly, I wanted to touch on, there are 3 different types of behavioral analysis, just sort of top level things that I wanted to discuss. There's the conceptual, the experimental, and the applied. The applied behavioral analysis is specifically what I'm talking about today. So conceptual, this is like very philosophical, thinking about things and really sort of studying from a theoretical standpoint, how do we think that this works? Very useful and helpful, but just not what I want to talk about here. Experimental, this is really just research. This is really research-based. And this takes me to one of my other big points that I wanted to bring up as sort of I go through this. there isn't a lot of, I see this sometimes, but there isn't a lot of academic research that gets used in a technical, practical way, like on a day-to-day basis. I use research because I, did that with my dissertation and with, being a professor, but it's not something that I typically see people like, oh man, I want to read this academic journal, this computer science IEEE or ACM journal, that may have the latest research, in a practical or like a technical environment. And then here, when we're talking about applied behavioral analysis, this is really promoting behavioral change. So there are a couple of different ways that you can do this, but actually watching someone, how they behave, how they act, the things that they do that might be positive or negative impacts on their own life, and then how do you change that behavior? So like someone who smokes and wants to quit, how can you help them, quit smoking if that's what they want to do? So this is what I was sort of alluding to, this discrete trial training versus the natural environment training. There's a couple different ways that behavioral analysis, psychologists and therapists that they do this, that they help to change behavior in people. So one of the ways, this discrete trial training, you're really breaking down complex behaviors. So it wouldn't just be, it may not be smoking or something like that. It may be something rooted in, something that happened in someone's childhood, or, like a fear of spiders or something like that. Like, I don't know, okay, I'm definitely scared of spiders. But yeah, so how do you break down that complex fear that maybe has been built up over years and years and years, but might be negatively impacting someone's life? So how do you reward someone? How do you change the way that they do things? Versus natural environment training, where you're not saying to someone, you need to change this behavior now, and I'm going to tell you how to do it. You are waiting until someone is, someone would go to the therapist and say, okay, I'm tired of being scared of spiders. I run out of my house every time I see one. I can't do this anymore. I need help. Where the therapist would then help them to gradually, introduce the concept of spiders, maybe talk about it, and then maybe show pictures, and then maybe do a physical demonstration with a spider, and then maybe have them hold the spider, things like that, where it's this really gradual, gentle sort of way of changing someone's behavior. And the idea is that you're hopefully changing the way that they do things on a daily basis. This is really what I'm talking about here in regards to cybersecurity, and we're going to get into it a little bit more deeply, but how can we evaluate what we are doing on a day-to-day basis, and whether it's us as cybersecurity practitioners or our users or our user population, whatever it might be, the different groups that we work with, how can we understand their behavior to ultimately help them change it? So if I know that annual cybersecurity training is not necessarily changing the cybersecurity habits of my users, what can I do to better help them? Is it a nudge? Is it an alert? Is it a face-to-face meeting with them to talk with them and introduce myself as a cybersecurity professional? Something like that, where you start to say, what are some of the other things that I can potentially do to help my users, and maybe some of my users that really cybersecurity does not come easy to them? How can I start to change those behaviors? So quickly, because I'm in academia too, I had to talk about the latest research. I will not bore you guys to tears with, what all of these things are, but I did want to put some references up here and some resources up here, because I wanted to talk about sort of what's going on in behavioral analysis research right now. In behavioral analysis, they're talking about a lot of the same things that we talk about in cybersecurity, in IT, OT, machine learning. How can machine learning, how can AI help us sort of how can it help us change our behaviors? How can it help us learn maybe what we need to change? Maybe it's not as simple as like, oh, I see I'm doing this one task repeatedly in the same way, and I'm not getting, I'm not making this any better. Maybe this tool can help me understand that this same behavior that I'm doing is not effective and it's not helpful, and I need to change that. And then I just quickly wanted to talk about this, probably because I think we're probably all very familiar with social media at this point, but there's a lot of behavioral analysis that has really, since technology is, it's what we use all the time, all day, every day, whether it's our laptop or tablet or phone, whatever it is. There is a lot of behavioral analysis work that's being done on how social media, how technology impacts how we function as humans, right? You know, because there's a lot of research on technology addiction, things like that, which isn't what I'm talking about here, but more so that there is a lot of the same types of problems that they're seeing in behavioral analysis that we're seeing in cybersecurity, with the way that people keep doing the same things over and over again. So if we can start to understand the behavior, why people are doing what they're doing, then we can change that behavior and use positive reinforcement or help people to learn sort of better ways of handling situations. All right, so what in the world does this have to do with cybersecurity? You know, I mentioned it sort of at the top of this, but cyber attacks happen the same way that they've been happening for a long, long time. Phishing attacks are still huge. It was funny, I heard someone the other day mention that they're like, oh, you know, phishing, I'm not as worried about phishing attacks. And I was like, really? I was like, there's still like 60%. I can't remember what the latest statistic was from one of the reports from like Verizon, the data breach report, but like the phishing attacks are still super high. And when you think about how these types of attacks can happen, like ransomware, and how devastating they can be, if it happens because of a phishing attack, but they're super devastating, you know, I'm still concerned about phishing and how we can help our users, you know, not click on that link or not download that file, you know, that Word file, whatever it might be. And we have a hard time, you know, stopping them. You know, users need to have access to certain websites. They have to have access to applications. So it's sort of this, how can we help change user behavior to help them understand that certain things that you click on will always be, you know, a concern. It will always be a concerning thing. You know, it's about changing mindset and changing behavior. You know, cyber attacks can go months or years without being detected. Why is that? You know, how is it that maybe our alerts aren't set up properly? Maybe we're unable to detect them because, you know, the technology doesn't exist yet for us to detect them. Maybe we weren't looking out for this. Maybe, you know, it could be any number of factors, right? But the idea is that, you know, we have to understand, especially as cybersecurity practitioners, so many different types of attacks, so many different threats all the time that we are, you know, take this Log4j, right? There was another patch released, I think, a day or two ago, and it's going to be something that's going to continue to evolve. That is one product, well, not one product because it's in multiple products, but do you know what I mean? It's one exploit, it's one type of exploit. And think about how many exploits are happening in the wild right now, how many APT groups out there are, you know, targeting certain types of industry. You know, like if you're in the financial sector, you've got a whole other world of things you have to worry about. And so the point is, there's so much complexity with what we do every day. And if we can start to understand where our problems really are and have those hard conversations, I think that's another really important point I want to make. Sometimes it's a hard conversation about, you know, introspection. How did I handle this situation? Could I have handled it differently? Could I have communicated more effectively? Because I think we talk about like, well, you know, there was this alert, it was this IP, it was this thing, it was this, it was that. How about how we're communicating? How about how we're talking with other people? Did I handle that well? Could I have said it in a different way that would have been more meaningful for that individual? So sort of empathy, understanding, collaboration, all those things that sort of come together that can actually make us really more effective as cybersecurity teams. Because if we have certain behaviors or certain patterns of behavior, it could potentially negatively impact the security of a program. And I'm not just speaking about security practitioners, I'm speaking about anybody. If we have bad habits or bad behaviors or things like that, like let's say, for example, if I'm playing Candy Crush for 8 hours a day on my work computer, that's a pretty bad habit. And not just for me and my work ethic and what I need to be doing as an employee, that's really bad for the security posture of the network, because what if a malicious ad pops up on my Candy Crush game and I click on it? So, so I think it's about starting to help people understand that certain behaviors have security consequences. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of different teams. I don't obviously have time to get into all of them today, but I wanted to talk about a couple. So as a blue teamer, how are we training habits into blue teams? So as someone that comes from IT operations, I have a very good understanding of how systems work together, what the typical day of an IT operations group looks like, an engineer or an administrator or an IT architect, infrastructure, whatever it might be. I sort of understand what the day-to-day looks like. That helps me have empathy and understanding for the IT groups that I work with now on the security side. So, when I go talk with someone who is, hey, I've got vulnerabilities and I need to fix them and I don't know what to do, instead of me saying, well, gosh, you're really going to need to figure that out, I can say, okay, well, let's take these one at a time. Let's prioritize these. Let's see what we can do to make your life a little bit easier. If I can help provide more information, or if you're stuck, or if you can't apply this control or fix this vulnerability, what can I help you do to mitigate? What can I help you do to apply some other sort of control, so that way we know we're at least adding some sort of security into your environment. So as far as behaviors go, having that empathy and understanding can really change the interaction between IT groups. Burnout. Burnout is another thing. As far as behavioral analysis goes, if you're in a SOC, if you're working in an IT operations environment too, if you're working 24/7, and especially, I have so much empathy for anyone that's working on all the Log4j stuff right now, because that can be a full-time job, and that means that all the other things that you're supposed to be working on sort of fall by the wayside, or you have to work extra hours to do that. So how can we help to identify burnout? How can we identify the patterns of behavior that come with someone who is starting to get burnout, so that we can help them? So how can I help someone who I see is struggling, or I see is having a hard time? And then how can I help my SOC? How can I help manage, if I'm managing alerts as a security engineer or managing our tools? How can I automate? How can I change the way that I do things day to day? How many manual tasks do I have versus automated? So how can I change the behavior of what we're doing as a team? Because if I see someone doing the same manual task every day, I'm gonna be like, yeah, we're gonna create a script, we're gonna automate that. We're taking that off your table, because that leads to burnout, that leads to people leaving their jobs, and turnover, which is never good for a security program, especially if someone had a lot of knowledge specific to that role and it wasn't written down. That's never good for a company, so or a security team. So how can we start to change the way that we do things, even within our SOC, so that we can help the people that are looking at 5,000 alerts a day, or just constantly looking at network traffic? And so what can we do to sort of help them? And then red teams. I think a lot of people that, at least that I've met, that are ethical hackers, they do penetration tests, they do understand a lot of the behavior of users, but in the way that how can I exploit? What vulnerabilities can I use? How can I leverage what I have to create an attack? And then to ultimately, provide it to a blue team, or provide it to, a company, and say, hey, here's your gaps and here's what you need to fix and here's how to fix it. But, does that include empathy? I don't know, maybe it does, but that's a question, right? Like, is that part of the behavior that we have? Or is it a technical exercise that I say, I'm going to test these 15 controls and see if I can get in. Okay, I can't get in that way. I'm going to try a different way. I'm going to try a different way. Is it a technical exercise, or is it a human exercise? So I think as far as looking at habits, looking at behaviors, how are you looking at the network? Is it from a purely technical social engineering, like I just need to break in however I can? Or is there some sort of, is there another behavior or a pattern that's going on that maybe inhibits what's going on? If for example, like pen test teams, red teams that I've seen, they are so good at persistence. They have so much persistence, determination, the ability to just say, you know what, this isn't working. I'm going to try this instead. I'm going to try this instead. What if we could take that mindset, that determination, that persistence, maybe that's a good behavior that we want to integrate into other teams. How can we take that good behavior and help other teams understand this type of persistence, this type of determination to get something done? So maybe it's a teachable thing. Maybe it's not a negative thing, but a positive thing that we can help teach to other people. So again, just another consideration, but for a different team. DevSecOps. So, for a security engineer or anyone who's working with development teams, I think there's this sort of, it can be difficult to understand if you're coming in from a purely security perspective and you're coming in and working with a team of developers, what are the habits that are going on? What sort of behaviors have sort of been adapted or have changed over time within the development team? Do they have a lot of pressure on them to just get things done really quickly? Were they trained in security? Did they, even when they were going through, whether it was a university program or through training, was security taught to them? Were they taught to write secure code, or were they taught to write code quickly, efficiently, and get it done? So it's sort of that question too, I think, of what habits do they have? Is it the habit or the mentality to code securely, or is that something we need to help teach? So how can security engineers, if there is a DevSecOps program or something that's being developed, how can security engineers work with developers, product owners, vendors? How can third parties, contractors, consultants, how can they work with other groups to help them understand how to integrate security? And I think by understanding what their typical behavior is, what a typical day looks like for a developer, I think could certainly help have that empathy and understanding, figuring out what they're doing every day, so that way they can come in and say, you know what, I think this might be better for you. I think if we try this, this might be helpful. So that way you're coming in from the perspective of, hey, I'm watching you do what you do every day. I'm seeing you code every day. I'm seeing the projects you're working on, the teams that you integrate with, or sort of what your timelines are even. And now I can come in and provide, recommendations for you and your specific team, instead of just, hey, you have these vulnerabilities, fix them. So it's expanding that conversation using behavioral analysis. So what can I do about it? What can you do about it? I think the biggest thing is understanding that there are other tools and techniques outside of the technical things that we have. There's, besides Nmap or FireEye or antivirus or whatever it is that you have in your environment, there are other things that we can do to improve security within our programs and across different teams. It's not just a conversation that has to be had for a blue team or for a SOC or for network engineers or anything like that, that it can be a custom conversation, and that if we understand the behaviors of our users, our teams, ourselves, that maybe we can help improve the security of our program through those methods too. It was one of the reasons why I wanted to do the human factors research and understand how we use terminology, because I think the way we use terminology, the way we talk to each other, sometimes can impact the way that security is actually implemented, or sort of works in our environment. I certainly request that people look at research. There is so much research available, academic or otherwise, on behavioral analysis, and I think if we continue to do this, there's certainly some gaps in the research, especially when it comes to cybersecurity, that I know I would love to work on. But I think if we can just sort of know that this exists, do a little bit of research on it, and start to understand maybe your own behaviors first. So what are my behaviors? How do I, what am I doing to impact security in my environment? And then sort of expand that conversation to other people. And even, I think that the other biggest thing that I wanted to mention too is that this is not a negative conversation. This is not a, well, you did this and you did that, like the finger pointing thing, that doesn't work. What does work is talking with people and having empathy for them and understanding what their challenges are. And I think ultimately at the root of what's going on with cybersecurity and a lot of the things that we have going on that we just can't seem to fix, I think if we can bring it back to the fact that we're all humans and we all make mistakes and we all have our own patterns of behavior, and if we can understand them and improve them, that will ultimately help improve the security of our programs. So research, 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 research. I could probably say that like 15 more times. This is something that I think a lot of cyber programs probably don't have the budgets for, because a lot of security programs are still small. I know they're getting a lot bigger these days, but a human factors engineer, a cognitive psychologist, why not consider hiring one of those on your security team? I know a couple of great researchers out there. I want to mention Dr. Margaret Cunningham. She was a cognitive psychologist, and now she's in the security world, and she blends a lot of the research together. It's super helpful. Like the blending sort of some of these things together can be very helpful and help, you know, your team improve what they're doing already. Consider training teams on behavioral analysis techniques. Why not have a psychologist come in and do a seminar, do a training? You know, why not? It can't hurt anything. It might be helpful. So, and then understanding the different types, I think, of behavioral analysis and how they might be applicable to your cyber program specifically could be really helpful. Peer pressure. This is something I haven't mentioned in the presentation yet, but I think it's an important conversation. If we think about the external factors, right? So not just, you know, what am I doing as a cyber practitioner within my own group and in my own, you know, sort of bubble, but how do I feel? Do I feel peer pressure? Do I feel pressure from the industry to have certain certifications, to have certain training, to do this, 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 and that, whatever it might be, you know, versus thinking about how our behaviors and how we actually interact with each other might be just as impactful. Instead of feeling maybe like this pressure to do something in a certain way, but sort of evaluating introspection, self-reflection, like seeing how those things might benefit us or benefit our programs as well. So with that sort of ends my presentation. Again, huge thank you to GRIMMCon for having me.